How people actually lived in colonial America. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to another quiet corner of the past. A time before neon lights, before takeout, before even the concept of personal hygiene as we know it. So, if you've settled under your blanket, adjusted your pillow, and found that perfect spot where your face half sinks into comfort, let's gently step into the world of colonial America. Now, the phrase colonial America usually brings to mind those neat textbook paintings, powdered wigs, crisp coats, men signing things with feathers, and women holding baskets full of freshly baked pies. But, as you might guess, the real version was slightly less charming. There were no cozy farmhouses with matching shutters, no cheery barn dances every weekend, and very little soap. What people actually lived like in the colonies was a long, slow negotiation between ambition and mud. So let's drift through it. We'll wander through smoky cabins, muddy streets, and the uneven rhythm of a society that was constantly trying to look like England while being, very stubbornly, not England at all. Settling in. A muddy start. Let's start with the early 1600s. Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in the New World. The word permanent here is doing a lot of heavy lifting. When 104 English men and boys landed in 1607, they were full of grand dreams about gold and glory. Unfortunately, what they found was heat, mosquitoes, and a swamp that smelled faintly of despair. They built wooden palisades, which were basically large, splintery fences, and small huts that offered very little comfort, especially when you considered that half the population died in the first year. They had expected to find piles of treasure waiting for them, as if the continent had politely left it out like a welcome basket. Instead, they got dysentery. Food was scarce, morale was low, and everyone was slowly realizing that maybe they should have brought more farmers and fewer gentlemen who didn't know how to dig. One of the colony's leaders, John Smith, yes, that John Smith, tried to bring order. He was famously practical and slightly intolerable, insisting that anyone who didn't work wouldn't eat. A fair rule, if you ignore the fact that half of them were too sick to stand. They grew corn with the help of the Powhatan people, though help might be a generous word. Relations were tense, and the English were not exactly subtle about their intentions to take over everything. Still, without the indigenous peoples, the colonists would have starved entirely, which they almost did anyway, in what came to be called the starving time. It's one of those historical phrases that sounds quaint until you realize it involved boiling shoe leather for soup. The colonial home once. The colonies began to stabilize. That is, once people stopped dying quite so quickly. They began to build homes that didn't immediately fall apart in the rain. These were usually one-room houses made of timber, with thatched roofs and a single fireplace that served as stove, heater, and sometimes funeral pyre for your dignity. Most families slept together in the same room, Privacy was not an 18th century luxury. The parents might have a small bed, the children slept on straw pallets or benches, and guests were given what was optimistically called the truckle bed, basically a drawer that you slept in. Windows, if they existed, were covered with oiled paper, not glass. And if you imagine waking up to the morning sun filtering gently through your paper window, you'd also be waking up to the smell of everyone's unwashed feet and whatever the chamber pot situation was that day. Furniture was sparse. A few stools, maybe a table, a single chest that held all the family's valuables. And by valuables, I mean wool blankets and the good spoon. The walls were decorated, if at all, with drying herbs or the occasional religious text nailed up for good moral reinforcement. Cooking was an adventure. Fireplaces were massive, blackened with soot, and prone to belching smoke straight into the room. Women spent most of the day tending to food that was either boiling, roasting, or both, while trying not to set themselves on fire, which, alarmingly, happened more often than you'd like to imagine. Clothing, mud, wool, and regret. Let's talk about fashion, because nothing says colonial luxury quite like 6 layers of scratchy wool. Clothing in the colonies was handmade, patched, and perpetually dirty. Washing clothes was back-breaking work, involving buckets of water, ash soap, and a lot of scrubbing against a wooden board, which meant, unsurprisingly, that it wasn't done very often. You simply wore your clothes until they either disintegrated or became self-aware. Men wore linen shirts, breeches that tied at the knee, and heavy wool coats that smelled faintly of sheep. Women wore long gowns with stiff stays, early versions of corsets, and aprons that they never quite took off. Children, up to about 6 or 7 years old, were dressed identically regardless of gender. Long gowns that made them look like tiny, confused monks. Shoes were precious. Leather was expensive. So many people went barefoot in summer, which sounds idyllic until you remember there were snakes, nails, and chamber pots. The wealthy, of course, had imported silks and velvets, but even those eventually absorbed the same muddy scent as everyone else. America was, if nothing else, the great equalizer in terms of odor. Food and the constant battle with hunger meals in early America were less culinary experience and more survival exercise. Corn, beans, and squash, the 3 sisters crops learned from indigenous farmers, were the backbone of colonial diets. There was meat when available. Venison, rabbit, or something unlucky that wandered too close to the homestead. Preservation was everything. Without refrigeration, food had to be salted, smoked, or pickled. And even then, it didn't always make it through winter without growing its own personality. Bread was coarse and hard, often baked once a week and chipped at daily like some kind of edible brick. Butter and cheese were luxuries that required both cows and luck. A good day's meal might be a stew with root vegetables, or corn mush flavored with molasses if you were fancy. Drinks were mostly cider, beer, or small beer. A weak, barely alcoholic brew considered safe for children. Water, after all, was often more dangerous than alcohol. The colonial diet wasn't all grim, though. There were apples, wild berries, maple sugar, and the occasional feast where tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and pies. Thanksgiving, for instance, was less about gratitude and more about, "We finally didn't die this season." Work, work, and some more work for most colonists. Life was an endless cycle of labor. Sunrise meant chores, feeding livestock, chopping wood, hauling water, weaving, sewing, planting. Leisure was practically an unknown concept, though on Sundays you were required to rest, which meant sitting still for hours while someone shouted scripture at you in a freezing meeting house. Children were expected to help as soon as they could walk. Little boys fetched firewood, little girls spun wool or watched siblings, and teenagers worked like adults, which was convenient, since they were often married by 16. Men farmed or traded. Women managed everything else. The idea of domestic management in the 1700s meant knowing how to bake, butcher, doctor, weave, churn, and occasionally deliver babies. Most colonial women could probably run a modern hospital using only butter, twine, and sheer force of will. Education was patchy. Wealthy families hired tutors or sent sons to England for schooling. Poorer children learned whatever their parents knew, often reading from a single tattered Bible or hornbook. Girls' education stopped early, replaced with useful skills, which basically meant how to make 17 things out of cornmeal and silence your opinions. The sound of the colonial world, the world of the colonies, was not quiet, though modern ears might have found it strangely peaceful. There were no engines, no hum of electricity, no constant background noise of civilization. But there were other sounds. The rhythmic thump of looms, the ringing of blacksmith hammers, the barking of dogs, the clatter of wagon wheels, and the omnipresent rustle of wind through trees. Nights were profoundly dark. Without street lights, the world beyond your candle was an abyss. People moved by lantern glow, or by moonlight, or not at all. Superstition thrived in that darkness. Witches, omens, restless spirits, and in many places, those beliefs were taken very seriously. You can imagine the quiet unease of sitting in a creaking wooden house, listening to the forest just beyond your door, wondering what might be moving out there in the blackness. The colonies were a land of both promise and paranoia, society and class. The English fantasy Colonial America liked to imagine itself as a miniature version of England. Polite, orderly, and stratified. Reality, however, was muddier. There were still elites, plantation owners in the south, merchants in the north. They built grand houses with imported furniture and servants, trying very hard to recreate the elegance of London drawing rooms, but outside those polished circles, life was far simpler and far rougher. Servitude was common. Indentured. Servants signed contracts to work for years in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. Many died before they finished. Those who survived often found themselves landless and broke, looking at their new world with growing disappointment. And of course, the colony's prosperity depended heavily on enslaved Africans. Men, women, and children forced into labor under brutal conditions. What did executioners do when they weren't executing people? Tonight, we're drifting back into one of the strangest corners of history. The quiet lives of people who were anything but quiet for a living. If you're cozy under a blanket, or you've just turned off the light and are listening with one eye already halfway closed, you're in the right place. Because tonight's story is about the men who swung the axes, tightened the ropes, and sharpened the blades, but also the ones who went home afterward, made dinner, complained about their neighbors, and wondered if they were being underpaid. Yes, tonight we're talking about executioners, and more specifically, what they did when they weren't, well, executing people. Because, as it turns out, even in medieval and early modern Europe, where death was treated as both entertainment and moral instruction, there still weren't that many executions to go around. At least, not enough to fill a 40-hour work week. And so the executioner, this grim, hooded figure we like to imagine lurking behind an axe, often had a surprisingly mundane day job, or several. Let's drift gently into that world. Imagine a town square in, say, 15th century Germany. Cobblestones glisten with the morning drizzle, a few chickens scuttle about, and there's the faint smell of beer, horses, and whatever passed for hygiene at the time, which, to be honest, wasn't much. And in the middle of this mildly fragrant world lives the executioner. He's an awkward figure in the town's social hierarchy, needed but unwanted, employed but untouchable, paid by the city, but banned from polite company. You see, the executioner was what medieval society liked to call dishonorable, lumped into the same social category as gravediggers, butchers, and prostitutes. Basically, if your job involved too much contact with blood or sin, congratulations, you were officially unclean. This was awkward, because someone still had to behead people, and the townsfolk preferred that person not be them. So the role usually fell to someone desperate, or already disgraced, maybe a criminal who had been offered a deal. Do you want to hang, or do you want to hang people? A surprising number took the second option. Sometimes it was hereditary, passed down from father to son, generation after generation. Whole families of executioners existed across Europe. The Sansons in France, the Reindels in Germany, the Frohnmeyers in Switzerland. Their children grew up in a strange twilight between fear and necessity, playing near the gallows, while other children crossed the street to avoid them. But when there wasn't anyone to be hanged, burned, beheaded, or broken on a wheel, what then? Executioners still had to live. They had to eat. They had to keep roofs over their heads, even if those roofs were conveniently located next to the town's waste pits, far from decent society. So they found other ways to make a living, and the first, perhaps most obvious one, was butchery. It made sense, really. If you could handle the anatomy of an execution, you could certainly handle the anatomy of a pig. Many executioners ran small slaughterhouses on the side. They were skilled with knives and had access to the best cuts, which, in a mildly disturbing twist, may have reminded them of other things they'd cut before. And because no one else wanted to buy directly from an executioner, they often sold meat through intermediaries, their wives, children, or trusted assistants. This pattern appeared again and again in city records. The executioner's family, though shunned in public, quietly kept the town's supply of meat, and sometimes medicine, running. Because yes, and here's where it gets even more fascinating, many executioners doubled as healers. Now, that might sound contradictory. How can the man who takes lives also be the one to save them? But in a strange way, it made sense. Executioners knew anatomy. They knew where to cut, where not to cut, and how long the body could survive under certain kinds of trauma. They handled wounds, dismemberment, and the human body more than most trained physicians ever did. And unlike the barber surgeons or apothecaries, they had access to something else: human remains. This is the point where you might want to make sure your blanket is tucked up tightly. Because, yes, in early modern Europe, there was a brisk trade in what you might call post-execution medicine. Parts of executed criminals were believed to have healing powers. A bit of fat, rendered from the body of a hanged man, could be used as an ointment for wounds or arthritis. Powdered skull, taken from a freshly decapitated head, was prescribed for epilepsy, and the executioner, conveniently enough, was the only one who had access to such materials. Many became known for their medical skill. People might not want to shake hands with the executioner, but they'd still sneak out at night to his house if they had a festering wound or a broken bone. There are even recorded cases of executioners being called upon to perform bloodletting, setting fractures, or performing crude surgeries, all in addition to their official duties. It was, in a macabre way, a full-service profession. Let's drift for a moment to one of the most famous of them all, Franz Schmidt, the official executioner of Nuremberg in the late 1500s. Schmidt was a fascinating figure, a professional in every sense. He kept detailed diaries of his work, which survive to this day. They reveal a man who was methodical, even gentle in his approach to killing. He prided himself on efficiency and precision. Over the course of his career, he executed 361 people, but he also treated hundreds more as a healer. Schmidt believed that his profession, while grim, was a divine calling, part punishment, part mercy. In his off hours, he ran a small medical practice where he treated everything from burns to tumors. By the time he retired, he was regarded not just as a feared man, but as a respected one, a rare ending for someone whose profession was literally death. And yet, most executioners weren't so lucky. In many places, they were forbidden from entering taverns or churches. Their children couldn't marry into respectable families. They had to sit separately during public events, sometimes behind a screen, so as not to pollute the sight of others. It was an odd hypocrisy. Towns needed executioners. They depended on them, and yet they treated them as untouchables. This tension created what historians sometimes call the executioner's paradox. The man who upheld the law was, by definition, outside it. He was both a public servant and a social outcast, and that duality shaped nearly every aspect of his life. To fill their time and perhaps their loneliness. Many executioners became collectors. They gathered strange relics, tools, herbs, and bones. Some developed reputations as amateur scientists or alchemists. After all, when your day job involves the fine art of separating heads from bodies, you might as well get curious about how the rest of nature works. In the 17th century, there are records of executioners who distilled herbal tinctures, experimented with metals, and even brewed their own liquors for medicinal purposes. They were practical men, but also tinkerers, quietly trying to find small ways to make their lives and perhaps their consciences a little better. And then, of course, there were the mundane realities. Executioners still had to shop for food, which could be a bit of an adventure, given that most vendors didn't want to touch their money, so they sent their wives or children. Instead, they had to attend court sessions, because they were technically civic officials, but often had to sit, apart from everyone else. Even their houses were marked differently in tax records, sometimes noted with a special symbol or color. The town knew exactly where the executioner lived, and most people avoided walking too close. Imagine living your whole life that way, doing society's dirtiest work, yet never being allowed to forget it. But despite it all, some executioners found ways to build small empires out of their position. Take the French family of Sansons, 6 generations of royal executioners. Their ancestor, Charles Sanson, began the trade in the late 1600s. By the time of the French Revolution, his descendant, Charles-Henri Sanson, was running what can only be described as a very busy operation. He personally executed over 2,900 people during the Revolution, including Louis XVI himself. And yet, even he kept a strange dual life, part respected state official, part social ghost. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but charmingly believable, that Sanson once apologized to the king before guillotining him, saying, "It is a painful duty, sire." The king reportedly nodded and replied, "Perform your duty, sir." And then, presumably, everyone went back to pretending that this was normal. Executioners like Sanson were sometimes well paid. In fact, Their salaries could exceed those of local judges or clerks. They received housing, stipends, and sometimes special privileges, like the right to collect the clothing of executed criminals, which, incidentally, they sometimes sold. Because nothing says thrift quite like repurposing the wardrobe of the recently deceased. They also earned side income from torture fees, a small but steady source of revenue, paid out whenever they were called to extract confessions. It wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. And as the centuries went on, the role of executioner slowly became less about social stigma and more about bureaucratic necessity. By the 18th and 19th centuries, some were even regarded as respectable government officials, just ones with a rather unpleasant specialty. How did people in the Middle Ages actually go to the bathroom? The unromantic truth about medieval sanitation tonight. We're drifting back to a part of history most textbooks glide politely past. We've all heard about knights and castles, kings and queens, peasants and plagues. But there's one part of medieval life that doesn't make it into the illuminated manuscripts. What happened when nature called? So, dim your lights, settle in, and let's gently wander through the wonderfully unglamorous world of medieval bathrooms. Or, more accurately, the places people went when they had to. Well, go, because behind every shining suit of armor and perfumed court lady, there was, inevitably, someone trying to find a discreet corner to relieve themselves. We like to imagine the Middle Ages as a world of romance and grandeur. Long banquet tables, tapestries, candlelight. But the truth is, much of medieval life smelled a bit different. People were surrounded by livestock, open fires, stagnant water, and humans who rarely bathed. And into that aromatic cocktail, we can add one of history's most consistent constants: bodily waste. It was everywhere. In cities, it ran down the streets. In castles, it collected beneath the walls. In villages, it soaked into the earth. And no matter how high-born you were, no matter how many titles or jewels you owned, you still had to deal with it. Let's start in the most obvious place: the castle. If you've ever toured a medieval fortress, you've probably seen a small stone alcove jutting out from the wall, with a hole leading straight down to the ground. That, my friends, was the medieval answer to indoor plumbing: the garderobe. The word sounds almost elegant, like a French wardrobe, which indeed it's related to. But this particular wardrobe did not hold your finest linens. It held, well, other things. A garderobe was a simple stone or wooden bench with a hole in it, usually built into the outer wall so that whatever went in could go out. Sometimes into a moat, sometimes into a pit, and sometimes straight down the castle wall into a convenient pile. It was a remarkably low-tech, but effective solution. And before you imagine some sort of grand medieval toilet room, no. Most garderobes were tiny, cold, and very drafty. The smell was enough to remind you not to linger. They were often placed near the corners of towers, or over running water if the architect was feeling generous. But ventilation wasn't really a design priority. So yes, if you picture a noble lord sitting on his stone bench in winter, cloak gathered around his knees, freezing in a tower with wind blowing up from the shaft, you wouldn't be far off. Royalty, not always as glamorous as advertised. Now, let's drift for a moment to one of those small courtyards inside the castle. Beneath the garderobe shafts, there would usually be a pit, or sometimes several, known as a cesspit, and every so often, someone had to empty it. That someone was not, as you might imagine, the lord of the castle. It was usually the job of a nightman, or in some places, a gong farmer. Yes, that's the real name. The gong was an Old English word for going. So, a gong farmer was literally a professional goer. And if you're thinking that sounds like the worst job in medieval Europe, it very well might have been. Gong farmers worked at night, for obvious reasons. They climbed down into cesspits with buckets and long-handled shovels, scooping out the accumulated waste by candlelight, and hauling it away to be dumped in the fields outside town. They were well paid, because no one else wanted the job, and they were required by law to live on the outskirts of town, because naturally they smelled like their work. There are even city ordinances from the 14th and 15th centuries specifying how far gong farmers had to live from the main roads and markets, usually about a few hundred yards, which feels fair, but as disgusting as it sounds, they were an essential part of medieval sanitation, one of the few things standing between civilization and chaos. Because, as it turns out, people were already discovering that too much accumulated filth could make everyone very sick. And they were right. Medieval cities like London, Paris, and Cologne all struggled with sanitation. Imagine thousands of people. No plumbing, no sewage system, no garbage collection. Waste from humans and animals poured into open ditches called sewers, which were really just long trenches that carried everything downhill. In some towns, these ditches flowed straight into the nearest river, which, inconveniently, was also where people got their drinking water. It's not ideal. In London, the River Fleet and the Thames became open sewers by the 1300s. The stench was legendary. One chronicler described it as a corruption so great that the air itself grew thick. And because this is medieval England we're talking about, the government's solution was usually to issue a sternly worded proclamation, declaring that people must stop throwing their waste into the streets immediately, which everyone ignored. Naturally, they made it worse. Meanwhile, at the other end of the social ladder, peasants in villages had their own system, simple, practical, and highly localized. They used pits dug near their homes, or sometimes just a corner of the field. Many had a small wooden shack built over the hole, a very early form of the outhouse. In crowded areas, these pits would be covered over periodically, and a new one dug nearby. And if the local lord happened to own pigs, the waste would sometimes be collected and used as fertilizer. Nothing wasted, so to speak. It wasn't exactly sanitary, but it worked well enough, provided you didn't build your well too close to your latrine, which, unfortunately, people sometimes did, leading to what might be politely called digestive surprises. But let's drift back to those who had the misfortune of needing to go while on the move. Traveling nobles, pilgrims, or soldiers. There were no public restrooms, of course, so travelers did what nature demanded, wherever nature permitted. Wooded areas were ideal. Fields, if you were discreet. There are even instructions in medieval pilgrim guides reminding travelers to go downwind of the road and cover it with earth, which is both practical and oddly courteous. In monasteries, things were a bit more organized. Monks had communal latrines, long stone benches with evenly spaced holes, often built over running water. They were designed with surprising efficiency. Some monasteries had small channels of clean water running through the floor to wash hands afterward. For a society not known for its hygiene, that was remarkably forward-thinking. Now, since you're still awake, or gently half asleep, let's talk about chamber pots, because not every medieval person wanted to trek to the garderobe in the middle of the night. The chamber pot was the medieval equivalent of a portable toilet. A small metal, clay, or wooden vessel, kept in bedrooms for nighttime emergencies. You'd do your business, cover it with straw or ashes, and set it aside. And in the morning, a servant or an unfortunate family member would empty it, sometimes out a window, into the street. Because, yes, that's what people did. If you were walking through a medieval city, you had to keep one ear tuned for the warning cry of "Gardes l'eau," French for "watch out for the water," which meant that a chamber pot was about to be emptied above your head. And so, with a certain grim logic, many city dwellers carried cloaks with hoods or wide hats, not just for the rain, but for protection from less predictable downpours. You might wonder, did castles and palaces smell better? Not really. They were larger, so the odors were more spread out. But they still had garderobes and chamber pots. Royal palaces employed teams of servants to clean them, including, in the English royal household, the famous groom of the stool. It sounds like a joke, but it was one of the most prestigious positions at court. The groom's job was to assist the king during his private moments. Yes, that kind of assistance, and to manage his toilet affairs. But because this person had unparalleled private access to the monarch, they often became incredibly influential. One Tudor groom of the stool controlled access to royal documents, petitions, and even money. So, yes, in a deeply medieval irony, the closer you were to the king's backside, the closer you were to power. Even queens and noble ladies had chamber pots, sometimes beautifully decorated ones, made of pewter or even silver. They were called bordelus in later centuries, designed with curved sides so that a woman could use them discreetly under her skirts. Some even had lids with handles to carry them elegantly, as though they were teapots, which, if you weren't careful, could cause very confusing mornings. Let's pause here for a moment, because if you're listening in bed right now, you might be thinking about how different daily life really was, how something as basic and universal as the bathroom could reveal so much about class, technology, and the human tendency to make do. And that's really the story of medieval sanitation. Not the filth itself, but the way people learned to live with it. They didn't have plumbing. They didn't have antiseptics, but they had systems, strange, smelly, imperfect systems that somehow kept civilization from collapsing entirely. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the details, how medieval doctors thought waste worked inside the body, what they prescribed for constipation or kidney stones, and the odd relationship between bathroom habits, religion, and medieval medicine. The unsung, unwashed heroes of medieval hygiene. Tonight we're drifting back to a time when cleanliness was less of a virtue and more of a vague rumor. So, dim the lights, settle under your blanket, and let's talk about the people who had the worst jobs imaginable, the ones who cleaned medieval castles. Now, cleaned might be a generous term here. In theory, castles were grand symbols of order and civilization. In practice, they were towering stone refrigerators full of people, animals, rotting food, and the lingering ghost of someone's chamber pot. If you imagine shining marble floors and glinting banners, you're thinking of a Renaissance painting, not reality. Medieval castles were damp, drafty, and perpetually fragrant. The question isn't how they were cleaned. It's how anyone survived doing it. Let's start gently with the most basic of medieval problems, filth. If you've ever walked through an old stone church and thought, "It smells a bit musty," imagine living inside one, with no plumbing, no windows that close properly, and 100 people who don't believe in daily washing. That's a castle. Everyday life meant fires for heat, animals for food and company, and people doing their business wherever seemed most convenient. Medieval nobles weren't monsters. They had chamber pots, but chamber pots had to be emptied, and the floor rushes, the herbs and straw scattered underfoot, had to be replaced. Both of these charming chores fell to servants. The servants, in turn, worked under the authority of the scullions, laundresses, and the dreaded gong farmers, the medieval sanitation workers whose entire existence revolved around the removal of human waste. Yes, their job title literally comes from the word gong, meaning dung. They were the lowest of the low, socially speaking, but also some of the most essential people in medieval society. A castle could function without a minstrel. It could even survive without a knight for a few days. But without the gong farmers, the entire place would collapse under the sheer weight of its own waste, both literally and metaphorically. So, what exactly did these people do all day? Well, imagine being lowered into a stone pit in the middle of the night, carrying a shovel and a lantern, surrounded by centuries of human history, And by history, I mean feces. That was the daily routine of the gong farmer. Most castles had latrines called garderobes, little rooms built into the castle walls, with a narrow shaft leading down to a cesspit or the moat. If the castle was lucky, the waste would drop straight into a flowing river below. If not, it collected in a pit until someone, eventually, had to deal with it. And that someone was paid surprisingly well for their misery, because no one wanted to do it. A good gong farmer could earn up to 6 pence a day, several times the wage of a laborer, but they couldn't live among normal folk. They had to work at night, because the smell of their clothes and skin was too overpowering for polite society. They were legally forbidden from entering taverns or churches, which, when you think about it, makes sense, but also sounds like the setup for the worst medieval rom-com imaginable. Let's drift up from the cesspit and into the kitchens, where a different kind of grime awaited. Castle kitchens were vast, smoky, and full of activity. Dozens of servants labored there daily, churning butter, roasting entire animals, boiling cauldrons of stew, and trying not to asphyxiate. The walls were coated in a layer of soot that could have stopped an arrow. The floors were greasy, littered with bones, vegetable peelings, and the occasional rat. At the bottom of this food chain, sometimes quite literally, were the scullions. These were usually teenage boys, orphans or unwanted servants assigned to scrub pots, clean the floors, and fetch water from the well. The work was relentless, the hours endless, and the pay almost non-existent. And of course, the water they fetched often came from the same sources used for, shall we say, other activities. If you've ever wondered why medieval people drank so much ale, it wasn't just for fun. It was safer than the water. But even small beer, the weak, low-alcohol stuff, had to be brewed somewhere, and that meant even more mess to clean. So the scullions scrubbed, the kitchen boys carried buckets, and the laundresses, well, they had their own nightmare. Laundry in a medieval castle was a full-body sport. There were no washing machines, obviously. Instead, there were rivers, tubs, ashes, and lye soap, which burned the skin and shredded fabric over time. Washing a nobleman's linen could take hours, if not days, and involved hauling gallons of water, boiling it over open fires, scrubbing everything by hand, and then laying it all out to dry in the sun. If there was sun, and of course, not everything could be washed. Wool clothing, furs, and fine garments were simply brushed, aired out, or sprinkled with herbs to mask the smell. Medieval people didn't believe in washing too often. It was thought to weaken the body and invite illness. So, the laundresses worked miracles with lavender, rosemary, and pure determination. If a piece of clothing was truly beyond saving, it was discarded or passed down to a servant. Nothing went to waste, not even something as personal as a sweat-stained tunic. By now you may be wondering, was the castle itself ever truly cleaned? The answer depends on your definition of clean. There were moments of tidying. Of course, when a lord was expecting guests, rushes would be changed, tapestries beaten, and furniture wiped down with vinegar. Everything would look and smell briefly tolerable. But deep cleaning, as we think of it, didn't exist. You didn't disinfect. You swept. You didn't wash walls. You hung new tapestries. And if something smelled bad, you burned incense, scattered herbs, or blamed it on the peasants. There's a medieval account describing a castle chamber being so full of fleas and lice that servants had to smoke them out with burning sulfur, which, to be fair, probably worked, assuming you survived the fumes. Let's pause for a moment and imagine the soundscape of a medieval castle. Dripping, water from the courtyard well, the crackle of fires in a dozen hearths, the clank of armor being polished or dropped. The distant thud of someone emptying a chamber pot, and underneath it all, the quiet shuffle of servants, always cleaning, always invisible. That's the real secret of medieval cleanliness. Constant, invisible labor. Hundreds of hands keeping chaos at bay, just long enough for the nobility to pretend they lived in splendor. And yet, despite all their work, the castles were, well, disgusting. There's a reason chroniclers rarely described the smell of royal life, because even the poets couldn't make that fragrant. And yet, for all its grime, the castle was still a symbol of power and luxury. Its great halls sparkled with candlelight. Its feasts overflowed with roasted meats, sweetmeats, and imported spices. Visitors were impressed by the sheer size of the place. Never mind that it probably smelled faintly of mildew and mutton fat. The servants kept the illusion alive. They swept the rushes, scrubbed the pots, emptied the privies, and washed the linens, knowing full well that by morning it would all need doing again, and somehow they survived. Though not always long, the fumes from cesspits were toxic, filled with methane and ammonia. Laundry work caused skin ulcers, kitchen burns were common, and infection was almost guaranteed. But to be fair, this was the Middle Ages. Everything was dangerous, and so life in the castle went on. Equal parts elegance and excrement, glamour and grime. We'll drift deeper into their world next, into how the servants lived, what they were paid, and how they kept themselves alive in a place that was constantly trying to kill them. Because if you thought scrubbing the floors was bad, wait until you hear about what they ate, where they slept, and how they handled the royal laundry when it wasn't just laundry. But for now, just imagine the quiet flicker of torches on damp stone walls, the faint smell of smoke and soap, and the low, steady rhythm of work, endless, necessary, and almost forgotten. Royal midwives carried extraordinary power. They could confirm a child's legitimacy, or destroy it. Their word determined who was heir and who was bastard. Many took that secret knowledge to their graves. Others were paid handsomely to forget things. A few, less fortunate, were accused of witchcraft if they knew too much. They were the first and last witnesses of royal hypocrisy. Women trusted to deliver the truth, then ordered never to speak of it again. The long sleep of forgotten. Children, most of the unwanted royal babies, will never know about. Their names weren't written. Their graves weren't marked. History has a habit of keeping its most uncomfortable stories under wraps, and few stories are as uncomfortable as a mother, queen or not, told to hand over her child and never ask again. But sometimes a fragment surfaces, a scribbled note in a ledger, a rumor preserved by a servant's diary, a skeleton found under the floorboards of a chapel, far too small for a tomb that ornate, and suddenly, centuries later, the silence cracks, just for a moment, and the baby history forgot breathes again, if only in imagination. Let's rest here for a moment. You can almost picture it. A flickering lamp, a scribe hunched over a tablet, carefully sealing his words in clay. He doesn't know if it'll ever be read. He just knows it's safer that way. In the next part, we'll drift a little further, into the worlds of spies, lovers, and magicians, where secrecy became a full-time profession. Who were the real witches before the witch hunts? Before the bonfires tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter, stranger century. One before the witch trials, before the mobs and the bonfires, before witch became a word whispered in fear. Because long before Europe began hunting witches, people already believed in them, but in a way that was oddly practical. So tonight, we're going to wander through the world of the real witches before the witch hunts, the cunning folk, the healers, the midwives, and the quiet souls who lived somewhere between prayer and superstition. People who mended the sick, found lost cows, lifted curses, and occasionally muttered things to the moon that no one dared ask about. So if you're ready, lights low, blanket tucked in. Let's drift back to a time when the line between faith and magic was so thin that no one could quite see where it began or ended. Picture a medieval village, sometime in the 1300s, a cluster of thatched roofs under a wide gray sky, smoke curling from hearth fires, chickens in the mud, a few suspiciously damp peasants arguing about who stole whose pig. And somewhere on the edge of that village, always the edge, lives a woman, usually older, sometimes alone, occasionally with a cat, because of course she has a cat. To her neighbors, she's not yet called a witch. Not exactly. They might call her a wise woman, or a cunning woman, or, if you happen to be in Wales, perhaps a Dine Hyssabes. Literally, a knowing person. Someone who knew things others didn't. How to mix herbs, how to read the weather, how to mutter the right charm when your baby wouldn't sleep, or your husband wouldn't sober up. And in a world where doctors were few, priests were busy, and medicine was more expensive than sense. These people were invaluable. Cunning folk, as they were known in England, weren't fringe figures. They were part of daily life. You might visit one to cure an illness, to find a missing item, to bless your livestock, or, if you were feeling particularly dramatic, to lift a curse that your unpleasant neighbor had clearly placed on you. They offered folk remedies, a blend of herbal medicine, Christian prayer, and a generous helping of don't ask too many questions. They might prescribe a poultice of rosemary and rue mixed with butter churned on a waxing moon to treat a rash, or tell you to recite the Lord's Prayer backwards over a basin of water to drive out evil spirits. It was medicine, religion, and magic all in one comfortable package, and most people were perfectly fine with that. And so, when the crowds dispersed, and the scaffold was cleaned, and the last echoes of public justice faded into the cobblestone streets, the executioner went home. He took off his blood-stained coat, washed his hands in the dim candlelight, and went about his business. Maybe he brewed medicine. Maybe he tended to his animals. Maybe he sat quietly by the fire, staring into the flames, wondering whether he'd done the right thing. The church, however, was less fine. Officially, the medieval church believed in the power of prayer, relics, and divine miracles, not the power of herbs and home incantations. But the church also understood something most inquisitors later forgot, that people needed their local healers. And so, for centuries, they quietly tolerated them. As long as your magic invoked God or the saints, and not demons, you were usually safe. So, many cunning folk cleverly added a bit of Christianity into their craft. They might begin a charm with, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost," before rubbing a sore leg with basil and muttering something that sounded suspiciously pagan underneath. It was a delicate balance. Half prayer, half hedge magic. But it worked. And this wasn't limited to women, either. Men could be cunning folk, too. In fact, many were, particularly those who traveled as peddlers, charm sellers, or fortune-tellers. One 14th century record from Essex mentions a man named John of Nottingham, a cunning man who was hired to magically kill the Sheriff of Leicester using wax effigies, which, to be fair, does sound slightly witch-like. But most were not political assassins. They were community fixtures, the problem solvers of rural life, and they existed across Europe. In France, they were called sorcier or devin, words that didn't necessarily mean evil. In Scandinavia, there were the Sadman and Voller, heirs to pre-Christian magic. In Italy, Strega worked quietly under the noses of priests, whispering charms that mixed Ave Marias with older, stranger words. Everywhere you went, there was someone who knew things. Now, the interesting thing about these early magical practitioners is that most of them didn't even think of themselves as magical. They thought of themselves as useful. They didn't fly. They didn't dance with devils. They didn't cook children in cauldrons. Those ideas came later, mostly from clerics with overactive imaginations and far too much free time. The real medieval witches were healers and helpers, and occasionally very effective therapists. If your cow stopped giving milk, you didn't go to confession. You went to the wise woman. If your husband suddenly lost his enthusiasm for life, or for you, you didn't ask the doctor. You asked the cunning man for a charm to warm the heart. Sometimes these charms were practical. Sometimes they were creative. One popular love spell from the 1400s involved placing a lock of your hair inside a piece of bread, feeding it to the person you desired, and hoping for divine results, which, if nothing else, explains medieval digestion. These practitioners inherited their knowledge from ancient traditions, a blend of Roman herbal medicine, Germanic folk belief, and local superstition. They used plants like valerian, yarrow, mugwort, and mandrake, all believed to have protective or healing powers, and they often wrapped their remedies in a web of symbolic language. For example, if someone had a fever, you might tell them to wear a garland of rosemary, because rosemary was for remembrance, and fevers were thought to be caused by forgetful humors. It didn't make medical sense, but it made poetic sense, and sometimes that was enough. Of course, not all their work was wholesome. Cunning folk also dealt in counter-magic, that is, undoing someone else's spell, because in every small village, there was at least one person suspected of being a bad witch. Maybe she glared at your cow and it died. Maybe your bread failed to rise and you decided she was to blame. So, you went to the local cunning man, who would perform an elaborate ritual to break the witch's power. It might involve burning salt, reciting prayers, or, in one recorded case, boiling the urine of the afflicted person until the supposed witch felt mysteriously ill, thereby proving her guilt. Science hadn't quite arrived yet, but these rituals gave people a sense of control. When your world was unpredictable, when a single bad harvest could ruin you, having someone who could do something about it mattered. And so, for hundreds of years, these cunning folk thrived. They existed in every corner of Europe, from the highlands of Scotland to the forests of Bohemia. Some became semi-famous, known across several towns. A few even worked for the nobility, providing charms for good luck, safe childbirth, or military victory. In the 15th century, Duchess Eleanor Cobham, wife of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, consulted astrologers and cunning men to predict her husband's future. Unfortunately, they predicted too accurately. The king found out, and she was imprisoned for treasonable necromancy. But even that didn't stop others from doing the same. After all, kings and queens believed in magic just as much as peasants did. They just paid better for it. Now you might be wondering, when did all of this turn sour? When did the wise woman become the witch? The answer is slowly. The early Middle Ages were surprisingly tolerant of low-level magic. But around the 13th century, something began to shift. The Church, increasingly concerned with heresy and spiritual purity, started lumping all magic together, even the harmless kind. And that shift was codified in 1487 with the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, by two Dominican inquisitors who really needed hobbies. It described witches not as village healers, but as devil worshippers, baby eaters, and agents of chaos. Suddenly, every charm looked suspicious. Every herb looked dangerous. Every lonely old woman with a cat looked like trouble. The world had changed, and the quiet cunning folk who had once been beloved became targets. But before that happened, before the panic and the fires, there was still a time when witch meant something entirely different. A time when it meant wise. A time when obi-ki teeter ta-ta-ta chi-e-d woman could murmur words over a sick child, and no one thought she was summoning demons. A time when magic and faith lived side by side, like two neighbors who didn't particularly like each other, but still shared a fence. And if you're still awake, let's linger there for a moment, in that soft, in-between world. The smell of herbs drying in a smoky cottage, a bowl of water reflecting the moonlight, a whispered blessing over a cradle. No drama, no persecution, just the quiet rhythm of people trying, in their own way, to understand the world, and to keep it at bay. In Part 2, we'll drift further into that twilight. We'll meet some of the most famous real-life cunning folk of medieval Europe, the healers, astrologers and alchemists who walked the line between medicine and magic, and the strange ways their fates intertwined with kings, queens, and the birth of the witch trials to come. Fashion. What happened to unwanted royal babies? Tonight, we're drifting back to the cradle, though not the cozy, comforting kind. You can settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe pour yourself something warm, because tonight's story wanders through the nurseries of royal palaces, the ones that were a little too quiet. We're going to talk about what happened to the children kings and queens didn't want, the inconvenient ones, the wrong gender, or the wrong mother, the babies born to mistresses, secret wives, or moments of poor decision-making that came back 9 months later in the most politically awkward form possible. Because while history loves to romanticize royal births, the golden cradles, the public celebrations, the 40 days of confinement for every heir adored by the court, there were several others who were quietly handled, and handled could mean many things. Sometimes they were smuggled into monasteries, sometimes they were given to wet nurses in distant villages, and sometimes they were simply written out of history altogether, which, in a way, is the most final disappearance of all. So, let's drift back to the Middle Ages. The candles are low, the corridors are cold, and somewhere behind a velvet curtain, a royal midwife is deciding whether this child will ever be seen again. The problem with too many babies. Let's start with the obvious. Medieval kings had a lot of children, some legitimate, some less so, some who were very much a surprise to everyone involved, including, occasionally, the king himself. Royal men were expected to produce heirs, but not necessarily to stop there. Affairs were common, and the social consequences were mild. For men, anyway, the issue arose when those private indulgences produced a child who might, inconveniently, resemble the king a little too closely. In an age obsessed with bloodlines, a child's existence could threaten dynastic stability simply by existing. A bastard prince could inspire rebellions. Surplus of daughters could ruin alliances, and a sickly or deformed infant could cast suspicion on divine favor. Because naturally, if your child was born ill, God was clearly trying to tell everyone you'd done something wrong. So, when a royal baby didn't fit the narrative, the palace had to improvise. The vanishing infants, sometimes. Improvisation meant the child simply vanished. Records were vague by design. A stillbirth might be recorded, whether or not it was true. A baby might be listed as weak at birth, and quietly removed from the nursery, never to reappear in any surviving chronicle. This was, in many ways, the perfect crime, committed not with violence, but with paperwork. Erase a line, omit a name, and history forgets the child ever existed. It wasn't necessarily murder, though sometimes it was perilously close. It was bureaucracy, and bureaucracy, as ever, could be both bloodless and cruel. The cloister option for the luckier, unwanted royals, or at least the more politically manageable ones, the preferred solution was the cloister. Monasteries and convents were ideal places to hide people. They were quiet, closed off, and obedient to royal will. A daughter born illegitimate might be dedicated to God before she could even walk. A younger son, inconveniently positioned between older brothers and no throne to inherit, might be gently steered toward priesthood. Sometimes they even thrived there. Freed from the suffocating politics of court, they learned to read, manage estates, and live something close to peace. But let's not get sentimental. This was still forced exile, dressed up as holiness. A royal baby in a convent was not there by choice. They were there because someone more powerful had decided their silence was useful. A royal example. The Hidden Daughters of France. One of the most infamous practitioners of baby management was King Louis XIV of France. The Sun King, who fathered so many children he could have founded his own minor principality, took great pains to handle the extras, his mistresses. Produced at least a dozen offspring, he, Tao, legitimized some. The ones whose mothers he happened to be fond of at the moment, and quietly disposed of the rest. The daughters, in particular, were packed off to convents. There, they lived comfortably but invisibly, becoming abbesses and nuns under royal patronage. They were technically safe, just forgotten. It's rather poetic that the man who built Versailles, the Palace of Mirrors, spent so much effort making sure no one could see his own reflections walking around in miniature. The wet nurse network? Now, if the cloister wasn't an option, or if the baby's existence needed to be erased immediately, there was another, simpler solution: the wet nurse network. Medieval Europe had an entire system for quietly relocating inconvenient infants. Wealthy families, and especially royals, would send newborns away to be nursed by rural women. Officially, this was for health reasons, fresh air, country milk, that sort of thing. Unofficially, it was a convenient way to make sure the court forgot about them. A baby sent out to nurse might never be recalled. Some died young. Childhood. Mortality was a convenient accomplice. Others were simply absorbed into their foster families. A prince, in theory, might grow up thinking he was a farmer's son. Centuries later, rumors sometimes surfaced. A local child with fine features, or an uncanny resemblance to someone painted in a palace portrait. Usually, they were just that, rumors, but occasionally there's evidence, a christening, record with a suspicious date. A payment from the royal treasury to a family of no particular importance. The faintest paper trail of guilt. Sensi, the spare sons, let's drift toward another kind of unwanted royal baby, the spare. In theory, monarchies adored sons. In practice, too many of them became a problem. Only one could inherit the throne. The others lingered, waiting, sometimes plotting, sometimes getting murdered just in case. Take the Ottoman Empire's problem-solving approach. Fratricide. When a new sultan ascended, he often had his brothers quietly executed to prevent civil war. This wasn't personal. It was policy. In some cases, infants were strangled in their cradles with silken cords. The royal method of choice, because apparently strangling with silk was considered more dignified. Centuries later, when that practice finally fell out of fashion, unwanted princes were locked away in the so-called cafes or cage, a gilded palace apartment where they lived out quiet, melancholy lives, waiting for a throne that might never come. A kinder fate, perhaps, but not a happier one. The scandal of too many women for royal daughters. The issue was different. Daughters were political assets, but only if properly married. Too many, however, meant too many dowries. In the late medieval period, European kings often had to offload surplus princesses like unwanted diplomatic furniture. Some were married off to obscure dukes. Some were shipped to foreign courts as pawns. And some, quite literally, were never allowed to marry at all. forced instead into convents to keep the royal purse from bleeding dry. King Henry VIII, for example, wasn't the only one who obsessed over producing sons. Most royal fathers did, because daughters cost money and could start wars if matched poorly. So, an extra girl might conveniently disappear from records, listed as stillborn, or sent to spiritual service, which sounds noble, until you remember it meant being shut away for life before your teeth even came in. When the baby was the wrong kind of royal now, let's talk about the illegitimate ones, perhaps the most famous category of unwanted royal child. It's an odd contradiction. Royal bastards were scandalous, yet endlessly fascinating. Courts loved to gossip about them, even as they pretended they didn't exist. Some, like Henry VIII's son Henry Fitzroy, were openly acknowledged and even given titles. But that was rare. Most were quietly placed with loyal families, raised as wards or servants, and occasionally summoned later if their existence proved politically useful. A few became remarkable figures in their own right: soldiers, scholars, abbesses, but most simply vanished into the background of their parents' glittering lives. A baby born royal, but never allowed to be royal. Raised in a house full of portraits that looked suspiciously familiar, with no one willing to explain why. The Queen's inconvenient miracle. Sometimes, though, the unwanted baby wasn't illegitimate at all. It was simply the wrong one. Consider the heartbreak of queens who were expected, demanded to produce sons, and failed. When a royal baby turned out to be a girl, again, the disappointment could be palpable. Ceremonies cancelled, bells left unrung, a cradle draped in pink silk instead of gold. These were not unwanted in the violent sense, but emotionally. Yes, they were disappointments first, daughters second. Queen Catherine of Aragon endured this 6 times before producing Mary Tudor. And by then, her husband Henry had already decided to rewrite the laws of God to get a new wife. History remembers the kings who wanted heirs, forgets the infants who weren't the right kind, silent midwives, and royal secrets behind. All of this were the midwives, those quiet, often illiterate women who saw everything and said nothing. Let's rest here a moment. In the next part, we'll drift through the politics of royal illegitimacy, the strange afterlives of hidden heirs, the mistresses who wielded power through their children, and the bizarre ways some unwanted babies became dynastic legends anyway. For now, though, picture a candle guttering beside a cradle. Somewhere, a nurse rocks a baby who won't be in tomorrow's court register. And outside, the bells stay silent. How did people in ancient times keep secrets without paper or locks? Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before ink and envelopes, before passwords, parchment, or padlocks. A world where keeping a secret meant actually remembering it. So, settle in, dim the lights, silence your notifications, and let's wander somewhere quieter. Somewhere where security meant trusting your cousin not to gossip, and encryption was probably just talking quietly. Because tonight, we're exploring how people in ancient times kept secrets before the luxuries of paper, safes, or the vague reassurance of the word confidential typed at the top of a PDF. It turns out humans have always been terrible at keeping secrets, but they've also always tried very, very hard. Memory as a lock before writing. Secrecy was a matter of memory. If something was worth keeping private, you didn't write it down, you remembered it, or, more accurately, you trained someone else to remember it for you. Priests memorized rituals, scribes memorized formulas, kings memorized which. Generals they didn't quite trust. Entire professions were built on oral secrecy. Egyptian priests, for example, guarded the words of their temple rituals like state secrets. Certain chants were never written down, because writing them might let uninitiated eyes see divine power they hadn't earned. So instead, they trained acolytes by ear, line by line, whisper by whisper. Imagine a line of priests repeating words you'll never hear, because they were never meant to reach anyone outside the sanctuary. It's the ancient equivalent of classified material, but with incense and better architecture. Codes made of flesh and bone, of course. Memory isn't perfect. People forget, or worse, they die. So some cultures used human messengers as living locks. If you wanted to send a message that couldn't be intercepted, you didn't write it, you taught it to someone. In Persia, the courier system under Darius III was famously efficient. But if you had a particularly sensitive order, you could go one step further. You tattooed it on the messenger's scalp, then waited for the hair to grow back. Only when he reached his destination would the recipient shave the man's head again and read the hidden message beneath. A bit unhygienic, yes, but undeniably effective, and probably more secure than any email password you've ever created. Clay, wax, and a little bit of paranoias. Soon as people started writing, they also started worrying about other people reading it. The ancient world's earliest attempts at secrecy came in clay and wax. In Mesopotamia, messages were sometimes written on small clay tablets, then sealed inside another clay envelope. If the outer shell was intact, the reader knew the inner message hadn't been tampered with. If it was cracked, someone had clearly been nosy. It's the Bronze Age version of "This email has been read." The Greeks refined this with wax tablets, thin wooden boards filled with soft wax. You could write with a stylus, then smooth the wax over again to erase it. A convenient feature for students and spies. One story tells of a Greek general who wrote a message into a wax tablet, then melted a layer of fresh wax over it to make the board look blank. When his messenger was stopped and searched, no one thought to melt the wax again. The receiver, of course, did, and found the hidden words waiting underneath. Guillotine method was crude but ingenious. A message concealed beneath apparent emptiness. The ancient ancestor of the hidden text feature. Secret strings and sacred knots. Let's drift a little farther west, and then far south, to a culture that stored secrets without writing at all. The Inca Empire didn't use written script. Instead, they recorded information using quipu, cords knotted in complex patterns. Most were used for accounting, crops, taxes, census data. But a few quipu scholars believe some were narrative, carrying coded stories or orders, readable only by trained officials. See, cords themselves looked harmless, bundles of colored strings, hanging in a household or temple. But in the right hands, they could reveal how many men were in your army, or how much grain you owed the state. And if anyone else asked what it meant, you could simply say, "Oh, it's just a decoration," which technically was true. Hidden in plain sight. Ancient people loved plausible deniability. If you could disguise your secret as something ordinary, you were halfway to safety. Roman generals used coded symbols on shields and banners, a sort of battlefield shorthand. Spies in Athens tucked tiny papyrus slips into hollowed-out walking sticks. And lovers, of course, invented their own miniature espionage. One Roman poet wrote about hiding love letters inside loaves of bread. Practical, discreet, and probably delicious. Meanwhile, in China, the art of micro-writing flourished. Scholars could inscribe entire poems on rice grains. A secret message could be concealed in the decorative script of a gift, or painted under a layer of lacquer, visible only when the object was broken. The technology of concealment was simple. Paper, wax, silk, clay, the psychology of secrecy, though that was eternal. The secret within the word language itself became a hiding place. Every civilization developed ways to twist or disguise meaning. Through codes and metaphors, Egyptian hieroglyphs were sometimes written in double meanings. Sacred, puns that only the initiated could understand. The Greeks toyed with substitution ciphers, and the Romans inevitably made it bureaucratic. The most famous example is the Caesar cipher. Julius Caesar's habit of shifting letters a few places in the alphabet. To us, it's child's play. To his contemporaries, it was magic. A soldier could intercept the parchment, read every letter, and still have no idea what it said. Unless, of course, he was very good at guessing, which, given Roman literacy rates, seems unlikely. Hidden geometry beyond words. Some secrets were written into shapes. Greek mathematicians hid their discoveries inside geometric riddles. Pythagoreans, for example, treated numbers as divine truths, only to be revealed to initiates. They used diagrams drawn in sand, erased immediately after teaching, their Most sacred figure was the tetractes, a triangle of 10 dots representing harmony in the cosmos. It looked simple. It wasn't. Knowing its real meaning was like holding a key to the universe, and so naturally, they didn't share it with anyone. It's a nice reminder that secrecy isn't always about protection. Sometimes it's about prestige, the feeling of belonging to a small circle that knows what others don't. Ancient secrecy was often less about fear and more about identity. Religious passwords religion, as always, took things further. Mystery cults from ancient Greece to Egypt and Persia guarded their rituals with the enthusiasm of modern copyright lawyers. Initiates were sworn to silence under threat of divine punishment. To join, you needed a password, a secret phrase whispered only to members. The cult of Isis had sacred hymns, never performed outside temple walls. The Eleusinian mysteries required absolute secrecy about what happened inside the sanctuary. Those who broke the rule could face exile, or worse. Centuries later, Christians borrowed the same tactic. When persecution was common, believers used the ichthys, the simple fish symbol, as a quiet form of identification. Draw half a fish in the dirt. If the stranger drew the other half, you knew you were among friends. No parchment, no key, just a curved line and a shared understanding. Love letters and invisible ink. Not all secrets were about politics or gods. Most, as usual, were about love. From the earliest civilizations, people have hidden affection under the radar of parents, priests, and spouses. The methods were delightfully inventive. In ancient India, lovers wrote messages on the petals of lotus flowers using milk as ink. Once dry, the writing vanished, but reappeared when warmed over a flame. In Rome, women sometimes painted letters in clear lemon juice on cloth, visible only when exposed to heat. It's charming, isn't it? Entire romances conducted in chemistry experiments, and somewhere, 2,000 years later, high school students are still doing the same thing with lemon juice and paper towels. The tongue as a key, of course. Sometimes the best way to hide a secret is simply not to tell it. And yet, humanity has never been good at that. Court gossip, tavern whispers, pillow talk. These were the informal networks that carried information faster than any messenger. But even in conversation, people developed small techniques to speak in code. Ancient thieves in Rome used cant, a form of slang that outsiders couldn't understand. Egyptian servants used phrases like, "The cat has left the basket," to mean the master's gone. Spies developed systems of gestures, or substituted ordinary words with agreed meanings. If someone said, "The market's closed," they might mean, "The guards are watching." It's not high-tech espionage, but it worked, most of the time. Some secrets, though, were meant to be found. Just not yet. Pharaohs sealed messages in tombs for the afterlife. Babylonian rulers buried foundation tablets beneath their temples, recording prayers and curses for future generations to discover. They were, in essence, time-locked secrets. Centuries later, archaeologists find them and think, well, we weren't exactly the intended audience, and perhaps that's the most poetic kind of secrecy, one meant to outlive its owner. A secret so well kept, it has to wait 3,000 years for someone to stumble upon it with a trowel. Every time humans invented a new way to keep secrets, someone else immediately invented a way to uncover them. What did medieval executioners do when there were no executions? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of medieval life. Somewhere far from kings and castles, but not too far from the chopping block. Go ahead and get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's talk about the people no one wanted to invite to dinner, yet everyone needed eventually, because tonight's story is about medieval executioners, the men whose job was to end lives, and who then had to figure out what to do with themselves on the days when no one happened. To need a head removed, it's not a glamorous topic, not a cheerful one, either, but it's strangely human, because behind the black hoods and grim reputations were men trying to pay rent, raise families, and buy groceries like everyone else, except that everyone else refused to stand within 10 feet of them. So, let's drift back. The air smells faintly of smoke and tallow candles. The streets are narrow, damp, and poorly lit. And somewhere on the edge of town, next to the gallows, lives a man with the worst job security in Europe. The job nobody wanted. Let's start with the obvious problem. No one wanted to be an executioner. In medieval Europe, becoming one wasn't really a career choice. You didn't wake up one morning and think, ah yes, a fine day to swing an axe for a living. More often, the job found you. Sometimes, a condemned criminal was offered a choice. Hang for his crimes, or take the job of hangman instead. You can probably guess which option most people took. So the executioner's role was frequently passed from one disgraced man to another, creating a hereditary line of professional pariahs. Their children often inherited the position, whether they wanted to or not. Imagine being a teenager trying to make friends, and everyone knows your dad chops people's heads off for a living. Birthday parties were probably sparsely attended, a necessary evil despite the social stigma. Executioners were essential. Cities needed them. Without an official hangman or headsman, justice couldn't be properly carried out, and medieval justice, as we know, was big on public displays. Executions were theater. They were morality plays with real blood, and the man in the center of it all had to be calm, professional, and, ideally, accurate. A botched execution was more than embarrassing. It was blasphemous. If you needed to decapitate a noble, and it took 5 swings, you could spark a riot, or at least an awkward silence, so executioners were both hated and needed. Like dentists, if dentists also quartered people for treason on weekends. Enti-twunners, days without death? But what about the other days? The slow weeks when no one was being executed? Most towns didn't have a daily supply of criminals worthy of beheading. Even in the rowdiest cities, executions were occasional. Maybe a few a month, or even fewer. So, what did executioners do to fill the time? Well, a lot of very practical, very unglamorous things. They cleaned, they stitched, they ran side hustles, and some, rather ironically, became healers. Yes, the same men who wielded axes also performed minor surgeries and sold herbal remedies. Because of their strange legal status, living half inside, half outside of society, executioners had access to human bodies and anatomy knowledge few others did. They learned how tendons worked, how joints fit together, and how long it took a human body to stop bleeding. Morbid qualifications, sure, but useful. If you needed someone to lance a boil or set a broken bone, in some German towns, the local executioner doubled as a kind of back-alley doctor. He'd bleed patients, pull teeth, and sell salves, all under the same roof where, on other days, he cleaned his axe. The butcher's cousin executioners also handled another kind of carcass, animal ones. Many doubled as butchers or knackers, people who disposed of dead livestock, because, again, no one else wanted to do it. Both professions involved blood, knives, and unpleasant smells, which apparently made them socially compatible. This also meant the executioner's house was usually on the edge of town, somewhere downwind, near the gallows or the tannery. You didn't stroll past it on your way to church. You made a deliberate effort not to, and yet, if you needed cheap meat, you might quietly knock on his door. Executioners were known to sell animal fat, hides, and sometimes even human remains, the bones of executed criminals, for medical purposes. Yes, that's right. There was a trade in powdered human skull, thought to cure epilepsy, and who better to supply it than the man who had exclusive access to fresh stock? The outcast with privileges, despite being social outcasts, executioners had peculiar privileges. They were technically free from certain taxes. They could enter brothels and taverns other people couldn't, and they often had the right to claim the clothing and possessions of the executed. So if a noble went to the scaffold wearing a nice doublet, guess who got to keep it afterward? It was, in a grim way, a kind of bonus pay. That said, wearing your client's clothes probably didn't make you any more popular around town. There's only so much laundry can do. Life in the UI margins executioners' families were also marked. Their wives had difficulty buying bread at markets. Their children were barred from guilds and apprenticeships. In some cities, their entire lineage was confined to a separate quarter, a kind of small, hereditary exile within their own community. And yet, paradoxically, executioners were often wealthier than the peasants who despised them. Their work was dangerous, but steady, and their fees, especially for noble executions, could be quite high. So there he was, the hangman, sitting at his own table, eating better than his neighbors, but entirely alone, a man everyone needed but no one would shake hands with. It's a perfect example of medieval contradiction. Society needed justice, but also needed someone else to dirty their hands doing it. The ritual of cleanliness. Speaking of dirty hands, executioners were obsessed with cleanliness. Partly for hygiene, partly for superstition, they cleaned their blades. Meticulously, they washed after executions, and they often performed small prayers or rituals. Before and after each job, many believed that spilling blood carried spiritual contamination. So while the crowd might cheer, the executioner went home feeling uneasy. His work was sanctioned by the law, but spiritually dangerous, which might explain why so many turned to folk remedies, charms and protective amulets. Some carried little relics of saints, or bits of parchment with prayers written on them. Others simply drank heavily. The line between religious ritual and drinking to forget was sometimes quite thin. The executioner's apprentice in larger cities. The job became professionalized. An executioner might have an assistant, or even a small team. The assistant handled preparation, sharpening blades, constructing scaffolds, or restraining prisoners. Sometimes he also carried out smaller punishments, whippings, brandings, or ear cropping, because of course the Middle Ages had an entire menu of pain to choose from. These apprentices were often relatives, sons, nephews, younger brothers, because no one outside the family would take the job. It became, by necessity, a dynasty of disgrace. In places like Nuremberg or Frankfurt, executioners' families lasted for generations, with records stretching back centuries. Some even developed coats of arms, discreet ones, of course, and passed down finely made swords designed specifically for clean beheadings. The sword of an executioner was a kind of paradoxical relic, crafted for justice, soaked in guilt. The science of efficiency execution wasn't always chaotic, by the way. By the late Middle Ages, it was systematic. Professional executioners practiced. They studied anatomy, timing, and even stage presence, because the act was as much performance as punishment. Some took pride in their efficiency, claiming to dispatch a man with a single, smooth stroke. There's even record of one Nuremberg headsman named Franz Schmidt, who kept a detailed diary from 1573 to 1617. It lists every one of his 394 executions, with notes on what each criminal had done and how the sentence was carried out. Schmidt also performed surgeries, treated wounds, and delivered babies. Yes, he was both, executioner and midwife. A walking contradiction with impeccable handwriting. His diary shows a man trying to balance civic duty with personal morality, haunted by his role, but proud of his precision. He prayed before each execution, fasted afterward, and donated to the poor. It's oddly touching and deeply uncomfortable. Public spectacle. When an execution did happen, it was a community event. People gathered in town squares. Vendors sold food. Children perched on shoulders to see better. It was equal parts horror and entertainment. The executioner stood at the center, calm and detached, as if he were just another craftsman, which, in his mind, he was. He performed the sentence, collected his pay, and disappeared until the next time. And when the square was empty again, he returned home to sharpen his blade, tend his garden, or sell ointments for toothaches. There's something eerily mundane about that. One morning he takes a life. That evening he mends his boots. The Middle Ages had an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization. The long wait, but weeks, even months, could pass between executions. So, what did he do with his time? He waited. Sometimes he trained apprentices. Sometimes he was called upon for lesser punishments, floggings, brandings, mutilations, and sometimes he was called to clean up, literally.